Behind every loud legend lies a quiet whisper. Stories that never made it into the chronicles, but changed everything. We will tell you of a fragile truce born from a single stolen rabbit, of secret paths within the walls of one's own home, and of the silence that follows the deafening cries of King in the North. We'd find it so cozy to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, get comfortable. Imagine a blizzard howling outside your window, logs crackling in the fireplace, and the only thing breaking the silence is our voice. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of an expectation you never asked for? The hall didn't fall silent all at once. It came in waves, like a slow northern tide licking at the wounds on a sandy shore after a furious storm. First, the most distant voices quieted, those of the squires and servants standing by the massive oak doors. Then, the knights and junior lords fell silent, their excited shouts drowned in the overwhelming atmosphere of sudden reverence. Last to quiet were those closest to him, the mighty standard-bearers of the North, whose throats had, just moments ago, roared loud enough to shake the rafters and make the flames in the hearths tremble. Great Jon Umber, whose voice was like the roar of an avalanche, set his goblet down on the table with a dull thud that echoed deafeningly in the sudden silence. And it was then, as the last echo of the word king faded into the smoky air, that a true, ringing silence descended upon Robb Stark. It was thicker than the densest fog, heavier than the deepest winter snow. This wasn't just the silence of an absence of sound, but the silence of the presence of something new and terrifying. Something had been born in that hall, in that deafening roar, and now it breathed beside him, invisible, yet palpable on every pore of his skin. He still stood, not daring to move, feeling the gaze of hundreds of people upon him, but he couldn't see their faces. In his ears, a phantom hum still lingered, an echo of that fervent loyalty he hadn't asked for and wasn't ready to bear. The path that had led him here, to this camp by the river, now seemed infinitely long, yet compressed into a single, fleeting moment. He remembered every step, every mile traveled from the walls of Winterfell, but now it all felt like a prelude, an unfinished prologue to a book he never intended to write. Somewhere deep within this silence lay an unvoiced question, the shadow of a broken promise he had made to himself in the quiet of the Godswood, the promise to bring his father home. Now that promise had become something else. It had mutated, expanded, transforming into a crown woven of steel, ice, and blood. And this invisible crown had already begun to press upon his temples, leaving the chill mark of cold metal on his soul, the mark of a path from which there was no turning back. He didn't remember leaving the great hall. His feet moved on their own, carrying him away from the gazes, away from the heavy, expectant silence of his men. Now he was in his tent, spacious, but in a campaign-austere way. The only source of light was a single candle on a roughly hewn table and the glowing coals in the brazier, casting flickering, whimsical shadows on the canvas walls. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth, leather, and smoke. Robb Stark, slowly, as if reluctantly, began to unbuckle his leather doublet. Every movement was precise and familiar, an action he had performed hundreds of times after a long ride or a training bout. But today, there was something new in this simple ritual. His fingers, accustomed to the hilt of a sword and tight reins, felt alien, clumsy. The leather straps, soaked with sweat and road dust, felt not like protective gear, but like shackles. He pulled the doublet over his head, and for a moment his shoulders felt immense relief, as if he had shed not just a piece of cured leather, but a part of the weight that had settled upon him in the hall. He sank onto the campaign cot, covered with a wolfskin, and began to pull off his high boots. The mud clinging to them was the mud of the riverlands, alien, river mud, unlike the dark, solid earth of the north. He looked at his hands, still the hands of a youth, with long fingers inherited from his mother, but already calloused from handling weapons, with hardened skin he hadn't had 6 months ago. With these hands, he had signed orders. With these hands, he had held a sword stained with Lannister blood. But were these the hands of a king? He ran a palm over his face, feeling the stiff stubble, and his gaze fell on the table. There, next to the candle, lay a rolled-up banner with the Stark direwolf. Not the banner of a great house, but his personal banner, the one carried before him in battle. He reached out and unrolled it. A gray direwolf on an icy white field, the symbol of his house, the symbol of his destiny. He slowly, almost mechanically, began to clean the fabric of road dust, smoothing out the folds. It was a simple, mundane action, an attempt to restore order, to return to the familiar course of things. But the fabric beneath his fingers felt alive, and the direwolf seemed to gaze at him with a silent reproach, a stark reminder of who he had just become. Near the brazier, curled into a huge gray ball, lay Grey Wind. Its eyes, 2 molten golden suns, were open, fixed on its master's every move. The beast wasn't asleep. It felt everything. The flame in the brazier swayed, and an orange glow danced on the embroidered direwolf. Robb's gaze unfocused, and the tent around him dissolved, giving way to a memory, vivid and piercing, like the cry of a hawk in the crisp, cold air. He was back in the Winterfell Godswood many years ago. He couldn't have been more than 10. Winter hadn't yet retreated, and the branches of the weirwood were dusted with snow that wouldn't melt even under the watchful gaze of the blood-red eyes carved into the white trunk. His father, Lord Eddard Stark, stood beside him. He wasn't lecturing, not giving lessons on lordship or war. He was simply cleaning his sword, ice. The massive Valyrian steel blade rested on his knees. Lord Stark drew an oiled piece of leather along the blade slowly, with the concentration he put into all his tasks. Robb remembered not the process itself, but the emotion of that moment, the sense of unyielding peace that emanated from his father. The air was cold, but beside his father, it was warm and safe. The silence of the Godswood was alive, filled with the whispers of the old gods and the creak of branches. Then his father lifted his gray, serious eyes to him, eyes that held no hint of the weariness Robb had seen in them in recent years. He said then that the direwolf on their banner wasn't just a symbol of strength, it was a symbol of the pack. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. He said it quietly, almost casually, continuing to polish the steel, but his words etched themselves into Robb's memory deeper than any command. In that moment, Robb didn't think of kings and battles. He felt only a deep, filial love and the certainty that his pack, his father, mother, brothers, and sisters, would always be by his side, an unbreakable wall, like Winterfell itself. The memory was not laced with nostalgia, but with a sharp, cutting pain. That same pack no longer existed. His father was dead, executed at the whim of another king, a boy tyrant. His mother was here, in the camp, but her heart was broken. Sansa was a hostage in King's Landing. Arya was missing, and Bran and Rickon remained in distant, almost unreachable Winterfell. He, Robb, was now the alpha of this shattered, bleeding pack, and the solitude he felt at that moment was absolute, far more terrifying than being alone on a battlefield surrounded by enemies. There was the fury of battle, the shouts of comrades. Here, in the silence of his own tent, there was only the void left by his father, and the cold realization that now he had no one to ask for counsel. The blade of ice was far away, in the hands of his father's executioner, and he was left alone with a burden his father had never spoken of. The memory melted away as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste of loss. Robb Stark was again sitting on his campaign cot, gazing at the glowing coals. The silence in the tent no longer seemed simply an absence of sound. Now, it was filled with the shadows of the past and the specters of the future. He felt the consequences of his new title, not only in his soul, but physically. The nagging ache in his shoulders seemed to intensify. This wasn't just fatigue after a long day. This was the phantom weight of a crown he hadn't yet worn, but which had already grown into his bones. It was the weight of thousands of lives that depended on his decisions. Every mistake, every misstep would cost not only his own life, but the lives of those who had proclaimed him their king. He rubbed the scar on his forearm, obtained in the Battle of the Whispering Wood, a thin white line on his tanned skin. Then it was a mark of victory, a proud reminder that he had met Jaime Lannister in battle and won. Now, that scar seemed like a premonition, the first of many marks this war would leave on his body and soul. He knew that new scars awaited him, and not all of them would be visible to the eye. Something stirred beside him. Grey wind lifted its massive head and laid it on Robb's lap. The weight of the wolf's head was real, comforting. Robb ran his fingers through the thick, coarse fur on the beast's scruff. The dire wolf rumbled quietly, but it wasn't a growl of threat, rather a low, guttural sound expressing concern. The beast felt everything. It sensed the tempest raging within its master's soul. The gaze of its golden eyes was fixed on Robb's face, and in them there was something more than animal loyalty. It was an ancient, mystical bond, rooted in the magic of the first men. Grey wind was a part of him, his shadow, his fury, and his stillness. And now, this shadow breathed beside him, sharing the invisible burden. Robb always knew when the wolf was awake. Their bond was so strong that he felt the beast's distress even in his sleep. And now he understood that this night would be sleepless for both of them. The title of king in the north had not brought him peace. It had only taken it away, perhaps forever. A sudden gust of wind struck the tent canvas, making it flap loudly. The candle flame on the table danced wildly, almost extinguishing for a moment, and in that very instant, something strange happened. A light parchment scroll, tucked beneath a stack of maps, caught by the draft, slid off the table, and drifted softly, like an autumn leaf, to the floor at Robb's feet. It wasn't a military order or a scout's report. It was a drawing, a childish, clumsy drawing, made with charcoal on a piece of parchment. A drawing his mother had sent him weeks ago, found among the things that had arrived from Winterfell. On it was depicted a dire wolf, but not the formidable symbol from their banner. This was a drawing by Rickon. The youngest Stark had drawn a large, smiling wolf, with a small human figure standing beside it. The caption was scrawled in clumsy block letters, Robb and Grey Wind. Robb slowly leaned down and picked up the parchment. He looked at this simple, naive drawing, and his heart ached. In that crude depiction, There was more truth than in all the Lord's speeches and the gleam of steel. This was the world he had left behind, a world where he was just Robb, the older brother who taught his younger sibling to ride ponies and told stories of heroes past. Now that world seemed as distant as the stars. He didn't react loudly. He made no sound. He simply sat, motionless, staring at the drawing, and then his gaze shifted to the banner hanging on the stand. In the flickering candlelight, for a moment, it seemed to him that the grim dire wolf on the banner and the smiling wolf in the drawing were looking at each other. One, a symbol of war, duty, and death. The other, a symbol of home, innocence, and the life he had sworn to protect. This was not a sign from the gods or some magical manifestation. It was a simple coincidence, a play of wind and light. But for Robb, in that moment, it became a point of no return. He suddenly realized that these two dire wolves were two parts of himself, and now they were locked in a silent duel within him. He carefully folded Rickon's drawing and tucked it into the inner pocket of his shirt, close to his heart. He didn't know why he did it, perhaps as a talisman or a reminder of what he was truly fighting for. Not for a crown or a title, but for the right of his little brother to draw smiling wolves again in a peaceful Winterfell. The weight of that simple scrap of parchment against his chest was no less than the weight of the invisible crown. Robb Stark rose and went to the table where maps were spread out. The Riverlands, the Westerlands, the King's Road. Names that, a year ago, were merely geographical terms from Maester Luwin's lessons, now became battlefields, strategic points on the map of his own war. He ran a finger along the bend of the Trident, the place where another dragon king, Rhaegar Targaryen, had fallen. History had a way of repeating itself, but he was neither Robert Baratheon nor Rhaegar Targaryen. He was Robb Stark, a boy whom circumstances had forced to become a man too soon. He weighed his chances. On one side, the loyalty of the North, the fury of the River Lords, his own tactical brilliance, which had already brought him several resounding victories. On the other, the immeasurable wealth of the Lannisters, the might of their armies, the treachery and intrigues of King's Landing. The risk was enormous. One wrong move, one lost battle could cost him everything, and not just him. He thought of the mothers who would lose their sons, of the children who would become orphans, of the lands that would be ravaged by fire and sword. The thought settled upon his soul like a cold stone. And then he thought of Winterfell again, of its gray, unyielding walls, the warmth of the great hearth in the main hall, the scent of fresh-baked bread from the kitchens. He remembered his mother's face when she looked at him with both pride and fear. He remembered Bran's laughter before his fall, Arya's defiant spirit, Sansa's dreamy smile, Rickon's trusting gaze. He remembered Jon, his brother in spirit, if not by blood. The thought of Jon always brought with it a complex mixture of love, rivalry, and a tinge of sadness. Where was he now? On the cold wall. Did he know of his father's death? Did he know that his brother was now the king in the north? The call of peace was strong. The desire to turn back time, to return to the day his father hadn't yet ridden south, was almost unbearable. To stay in Winterfell, to be merely an heir, not a king. To marry, have children, live a long life, and rest in the crypt beside his ancestors. But immediately, like a responding wave, the call of the path overwhelmed him. The fury over his father's unjust execution. The duty to those who had entrusted him with their lives. The necessity to free his sisters and avenge the dishonor of his house. This wasn't just a battle between desire and duty. It was a battle for his very soul. He could choose peace, but then he would betray everything he believed in, betray his father's memory. He could choose war, and then he risked losing everything he loved. And looking at the maps, he understood that the choice had already been made for him the moment he heard the shouts of King in the north. He took a deep breath and then slowly, deliberately stepped away from the map table. Enough for today. Enough strategies. Enough weighing risks. Enough thoughts of battles and death. For this one night, he would allow himself not to be a king. He would simply be Robb, a weary young man who missed home and feared the future. He walked to the brazier and tossed a few logs into it. The dry wood caught reluctantly, and lively, warm shadows once again danced across the tent. He took his heavy gray wool cloak, trimmed with wolf fur, from the cot and wrapped himself tighter in it. The fabric held his own scent, the smell of home, and it was a small comfort. Robb sank back onto the cot, leaning his back against the tent pole. Gray wind immediately moved closer, and Robb placed a hand on its back, feeling the steady beat of the huge heart beneath the thick fur. He wasn't going to sleep. He knew sleep wouldn't come, but he decided to grant himself this reprieve. He extinguished the candle, and the tent plunged into twilight, illuminated only by the soft glow of the coals. This gesture was a farewell, a temporary farewell to the burden he had taken upon himself. It was as if he was telling himself, "I will accept you, Crown, but not now. Grant me this night. Grant me a few more hours of silence before I lead my pack south." He closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the night camp, the distant cough of a sentry, the snorting of horses, the quiet rustle of the wind in the tree branches. These sounds were an anchor, holding him in the present, preventing him from sinking into the abyss of fears and doubts. He hadn't abandoned the path. He had simply paused for a rest. He knew that with dawn, he would have to don his armor again, take up his sword, and become who they had proclaimed him, the king in the north. But as long as this night lasted, he could allow himself to be just Robb Stark of Winterfell, and in this temporary respite lay his only strength. The fire in the brazier slowly died down, turning the bright orange coals to velvet red. The shadows in the tent grew deeper, thicker, blurring the outlines of objects and transforming the world into a realm of half-tones. Robb sat motionless, wrapped in his cloak, his hand resting on the back of the sleeping direwolf. He wasn't asleep, yet not fully awake, existing in a strange, shifting state between past and future. His breathing was even and deep, but in the silence of the tent, an unvoiced question still lingered. What would come next? Could the boy who played at war in the castle yard win a real war, where the fate of an entire kingdom hung in the balance? The coals in the brazier flared one last time, briefly illuminating his face. In his gray, stark eyes, just like his father's, there was neither fear nor triumph, only a deep, infinite weariness and a shadow of resolve, as unyielding as northern granite. He knew that the answer wouldn't come to him this night. It would come later, on the battlefields, in councils with his lords, in quiet prayers at the weirwoods, if he was ever fortunate enough to see them again. For now, there was only this silence, this fragile peace before the storm. And perhaps, the next time the shouts of King in the North swept over his army, he would be ready. Or perhaps not. The fire was almost out, But one small ember continued to glow deep within the brazier, a stubborn red eye in the gloom, holding the promise of a new, relentless dawn. What do you think of Robb Stark's incredible burden? Share your thoughts on his journey in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe for more explorations into your favorite stories. Ever wondered how folks in Westeros, before the age of smartphones and fiber optics, actually talk to each other across vast distances? I mean, really reliably. Most of the time, it came down to one thing: ravens. And these weren't just your average garden variety birds. Oh no, we're talking highly trained, master-taught messengers, bred to hit their mark, no matter the weather, no matter how many leagues lay between them and their destination. These incredible winged postmen, they're the ones who brought the outside world to places like Castle Black, a place where silence and a biting cold were basically permanent residents, where everything beyond the wall felt impossibly far, and the lands to the south? Well, they were practically a legend. Picture this. It's late evening at Castle Black. The wind, it's just howling, ripping right through every crack in the ancient stones, dragging that bone-chilling cold into absolutely everything. Snow, of course, has been the main view here for ages. A thick, white blanket over those harsh walls and frosty towers. And in one of the most unassuming cells, where a tiny hearth was pretty much the only thing fighting off the chill, and barely winning, let's be honest, you'd find Jon Snow. A single candle on a rough wooden table flickered, throwing these really weird dancing shadows across the walls, making ordinary things look kind of ominous. Jon, he was just lost in thought, staring into that struggling fire, which seemed to reflect some deep, uneasy feeling inside him. He'd actually gotten used to this monotonous, almost meditative existence here, these endless gray days melting into black nights. His entire life on the wall, it felt like it was carved from a totally different, much harder kind of stone than the one he'd known back in those sunny castles of the south. Then, all of a sudden, that profound silence shattered, not with the wind's usual groan or the familiar creak of old timbers. No, this was different. It was the sharp, piercing caw of a raven. But not just any raven. This was a messenger bird, and its call had a distinct quality, totally unlike the wild ones that nested around the wall. It carried something urgent, something genuinely important, the kind of sound that just makes your blood run cold and your heart skip a beat in pure anticipation. Jon, who was pretty much an expert on every sound within the castle, he recognized this call immediately. These were the ravens from the south. Their cawing, echoing and amplified by those stone corridors, it just pierced right through the thick walls, hinting at events that were completely unheard of in this remote, icy corner of the world. That sound, it was strange, right? Both deeply unsettling and yet, in a weird way, really alluring. Almost like a slender thread pulling him back to the life he'd given up. And sure enough, pretty quickly, heavy, measured footsteps started echoing down the corridors. They were getting closer, heading right for his cell. Jon, he wasn't surprised at all. This was, well, it was just routine. They always brought him mail. Whether it was fresh intelligence about wildling marauders or some stuffy official decrees straight from King's Landing, these messages always found their way to him, somehow overcoming incredible distances and dangers. The door, it creaked open really quietly, and there, silhouetted in the doorway, stood a young watchman. He was holding several scrolls, still tied to a raven's leg. The bird itself, it had clearly already flown off, probably heading for some much-needed rest after its long journey. The watchman just silently handed the scrolls to Jon, his face completely blank, showing absolutely nothing but pure weariness. It was just another day, another delivery. Nobody here, really, paid much mind to the actual content of these letters. I mean, life on the wall was already overflowing with its own constant worries and very real dangers, wasn't it? Jon took the scrolls. The parchment, it felt so cold and stiff under his fingers. Every single one of them had a small wax seal. You know, that telltale mark of authenticity. A kind of unspoken promise that the message hadn't been tampered with or read by anyone else. He didn't rush anything. He unhurriedly placed the scrolls on the rough table. Then he picked up one, the one that felt oddly heaviest. It was almost as if the sheer weight of the information it contained could be physically felt right there in his palm. The candle flame, it flickered just a little from a draft, casting these dancing lights across the wax seal, really making its delicate contours pop. This letter? It could be anything. News from Winterfell. Maybe something official from King's Landing. Or even a plea from some distant lord looking for a bit of help. Or perhaps some sage advice. Jon, he held that seal right up to the fire. He wasn't in any hurry. He just let the flame carefully, almost tenderly, lick at the wax. A thin, slightly acrid smell of burning wax slowly filled the small space, mixing with the dampness and the familiar smoke from the hearth. He watched it, just watched as the wax started to melt, losing all its rigid hardness until it became soft, really pliable. Then so carefully, with almost surgical precision, he finally broke the seal. It was a barely audible click, a tiny sound, and just like that, it was done. The seal broke, scattering into these tiny, almost insignificant fragments right across the table. It was almost like shards of an old life, a life he had quite deliberately left behind. That sound, so small, so utterly insignificant, somehow seemed to echo his very own break with the past, didn't it? The parchment itself, tightly rolled as if it had been waiting for this exact moment for ages, began to slowly unfurl under his fingers. A really soft rustle, almost like a whisper, filled the quiet cell. Jon unrolled the scroll very, very slowly, almost as if it were some sacred ritual. You know, as if each and every fold of that parchment didn't just hold words, but also the very spirit of the person who wrote them, and the essence of the place they came from. His eyes, they just glided over the familiar handwriting. Those carefully formed letters, they really did seem like messengers from some other world entirely, a world he once knew so intimately, and now, well, he only remembered it. Every single word, every phrase on that page, it carried echoes of his past. The sweet scents of summer gardens, the joyful clinking of goblets at those noisy feasts, the hushed whispers of intrigues down palace corridors. All of that. Everything he had so willingly given up for the stark black cloak and the bone-deep cold of the wall. He read, his face a perfect mask, completely impassive. Outwardly, he was absolutely detached. Not a single muscle twitched. No sigh ever escaped his chest. But inside, you could just tell. In his eyes, those intense, focused eyes fixed on the letters, you could just discern something really deep. Something that absolutely betrayed his true, unvarnished reaction. His gaze, it just froze on one particular line, and a tiny, barely perceptible tension flickered, just for a moment, at the very corners of his mouth. It wasn't a sigh. It wasn't a word. Just the faintest shift in expression. The kind of thing only the most attentive observer would ever pick up on. And in the semi-darkness of his small cell, well, there was no one like that here, wasn't there? Now, the information he got, it wasn't always exactly pleasant, you know. Sometimes, it would be news of a death, or maybe some petty squabbles between lords, or even much bigger misfortunes that had struck his family or his friends. And other times, honestly, it was just reports of events he'd completely forgotten about, or things that had never even directly concerned him. But here's the thing. Every single word, every tiny symbol on that parchment, it was a potent reminder that somewhere, way out there, far beyond those towering southern walls, another entire world just kept on existing. A world absolutely brimming with life, yes, but also pain, and intrigue, and love, and of course, hate. A world that just kept on moving, relentlessly spinning, while he himself felt utterly stuck right here, locked in this eternal winter and this endless lonely watch. He finished reading that first letter, his eyes slowly lifting from the parchment. He didn't need to reread it. All of that information, it had already burned itself right into his memory. He just carefully set the first scroll aside, almost like he was discarding a small piece of a reality that, while foreign now, was still somehow incredibly close. And then he picked up the next one. This one, it seemed even thinner, but its lighter weight certainly didn't mean it held any less importance. And so, the same ritual began again. The flame, the wax, that small, fragile crack. This exact process, it just repeated itself day after day, week after week. And each and every time, Jon felt those delicate threads connecting him to his past tighten. They felt like they were either about to snap completely, or, conversely, to bind him even more. Firmly to a world, a place, he knew he could simply never return to. That second letter, just like the first, really didn't pull any visible reaction from his face. Jon Snow, he truly was a master at hiding his feelings, honed by the incredibly harsh life here on the wall. But those eyes of his, you know, deep and so thoughtful, they always gave away the inner storm raging within him. Maybe it was news of his siblings, perhaps something about the very fate of Winterfell itself, or even just the latest twist in the political games being played out in King's Landing. Whatever the content, it clearly affected him profoundly, touching raw chords in his heart that he had so diligently tried to suppress. Each solitary gust of wind outside those towering walls, every single crackle of logs in the hearth, all those tiny sounds seemed to just amplify the sheer silence of his own reaction, somehow emphasizing a truly profound, almost suffocating loneliness. He just ran his fingers over that cold parchment, really feeling its slight unevenness, almost as if he was trying to physically grasp fate itself. These particular words, penned by someone's distant hand, had journeyed thousands upon thousands of leagues. They had traversed mountains, forded raging rivers, pushed through thick forests and treacherous swamps, all before finally reaching him. They had survived driving rain and heavy snow, navigated through countless dangers and uncertainties, and now, finally, they were right here, in his hands, in this freezing cell, carrying the undeniable echoes of other people's destinies. Destinies that, in some profound way, just kept intertwining with his very own. This isn't just a piece of paper, you see. It wasn't merely a carrier of text. Oh no. It was a true bridge between two distinct worlds, between his past and his present, between the cold weight of duty and the quiet, persistent whisper of desire. Jon set this letter aside as well, neatly folding both scrolls with a precise, almost practiced motion. He wasn't going to burn them, which, to be fair, sometimes did happen with particularly grim or unpleasant news. Instead, he just carefully placed them right next to the candle, where they somehow looked incredibly fragile, almost defenseless. His gaze, it drifted back to that steady candle flame. The fire just burned on, unwavering, casting these really long, dancing shadows across the cell. He sat there for a long, long time, completely lost in this deep, deep contemplation. News from the South, you know, it always left this peculiar, bitter taste in his soul. It was a constant, stark reminder of everything he had given up, everything he had so deliberately renounced, everything he had, in essence, lost. He had, of course, chosen this difficult path, this stark black cloak, this unbelievably harsh life here on the wall, all to protect the realm of men from the unspeakable dangers lurking beyond that icy border. But sometimes, on cold, quiet evenings, just like this one, when the distant voices of ravens carried those clear echoes of a world far away, he couldn't help but feel like nothing more than a simple prisoner, utterly bound to his duty, while real life just kept moving on, somewhere far, far away from him. Thoughts of all those people he'd just read about in those letters, they just flooded his mind. What were they doing? Right now? What was actually happening to them? How were they living their lives while he stood guard out here? These agonizingly unanswered questions just weighed so heavily on his shoulders. Duty, honor, sacrifice, those words he'd recited to himself hundreds, probably thousands of times. They suddenly seemed, well, less significant, didn't they? Especially when compared to the vivid, almost painful images of those he had so deliberately left behind. Outside, the ravens had quieted down, settling back onto their perches. The wind just kept up its same monotonous, lonely dance outside the ancient walls, and the cell, it simply fell silent once more, interrupted only by the gentle crackling of logs in the hearth. But for Jon Snow, this silence, it was anything but empty now. No, it was filled with the soft, persistent whispers of distant voices, carried all the way on the powerful wings of ravens from the south. Voices that would echo in his mind, I'm telling you, long into the dawn, when he'd once again have to shake them off, return to his grim duties, and try to forget the world he once knew so well. If you found this little glimpse into Jon Snow's world as utterly compelling as I do, then please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button on this video. Hit subscribe for even more deep dives into the intricate world of Westeros. And seriously, let me know in the comments below. In your opinion, what do you think was the single most impactful letter Jon Snow ever received during his time on the wall? Imagine a world where a truce could be forged not by a mighty sword, nor by a strategic, lengthy alliance, but by a single, simple, perhaps even stolen rabbit. Sounds incredible, doesn't it? Like something out of a fairy tale. Yet, in a world where the War of the Five Kings raged, where cities burned and human souls hardened, that's exactly how, in the very heart of the ravaged and dangerous Riverlands, two of the most seemingly ill-suited and irreconcilable companions found their fragile, fleeting moment of peace. This isn't a story of great battles where heroes in shining armor perform valiant deeds, nor of political intrigues shaking palaces. This is a story of silence, of an almost palpable stillness, broken only by barely audible sounds. The crackle of a small fire, the distant rustle of the night forest, and the heavy, electric quiet hanging between two lonely souls forced to endure each other. Night in the Riverlands fell swiftly, bringing not soft repose, but rather a harsh embrace of bone-chilling cold. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something subtly wild, primal. Around them stretched an immense, impenetrable darkness, interrupted only by the silhouettes of ancient trees that stood like silent, menacing sentinels. Only occasionally did distant sounds drift to them. The eerie hoot of an owl cutting through the quiet, the rustles of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, signaling that life here persisted despite human strife and madness. Arya and the Hound, or Sandor Clegane, as he preferred not to be called, for his name seemed to burn his tongue, filled with memories of his monstrous brother and bloody deeds, sat by a barely kindled fire. The flames hadn't yet found their rhythm, releasing more acrid smoke than life-giving warmth. But even these first, hesitant tongues of orange light were a priceless gift in the approaching, all-consuming darkness. They were two, yet each was achingly alone, each locked within their own fortress of pain and resentment. Their shared journey was forced, their companionship deeply unwelcome, but circumstances bound them as tightly as shackles of steel and necessity ever could. The Hound, as usual, sat hunched, his massive, powerful figure appearing even more cumbersome and menacing in the faint, flickering firelight. He uttered not a single word, his face disfigured by an old burn, grim and inscrutable. Occasionally, he would shift his heavy boot, stirring the embers to give the fire a little more air, a little more life. His gaze was fixed on nothingness, beyond the shimmering flames, into the impenetrable darkness of the forest, which he seemed to see through, anticipating all its dangers. Arya, in contrast, was wholly engrossed in a task. Not long ago, before dusk completely swallowed the forest, her sharp, observant gaze, trained by years of wandering and survival, noticed something. The Hound, lost in his dark, insoluble thoughts, had missed. A rabbit, a single, foolish, fluffy rabbit, which decided that an evening feast on young shoots by the stream was worth the risks associated with nocturnal foraging. And Arya, without a second thought, without asking anyone's permission, lunged after it. She wasn't an archer. Her bow was broken or lost long ago, and she didn't carry nets. But her years of wandering, her training with the Brotherhood without banners, where every day was a struggle for survival, had taught her incredible speed, stealth, and resourcefulness. She caught it with her bare hands, or almost bare, using her worn clothes as an impromptu but effective snare. The rabbit's death was quick, almost merciful, leaving it no chance of escape. And now, that rabbit lay between them, its fresh fur dark with spilled blood, but promising not only warmth and fullness, but also a temporary oblivion to the hunger that was their constant companion. This was not the first rabbit they had stolen, and most likely not the last. In these lands, where law and order were but a distant, almost forgotten memory, where every morning began with a struggle for existence, only those who knew how to take what was left lying around survived, or what was running around. The cooking process began with Arya. She took out her knife, thin and sharp, the very one that was a gift from Needle, her first real own blade, which she guarded more carefully than her own eyes. Her fingers, despite their small size, were nimble and strong. She set to work with astonishing dexterity. The rabbit's skin was removed quickly, with a surprising agility that spoke of repeated practice of this seemingly repulsive act. She worked methodically, paying no attention whatsoever to the ominous, oppressive silence emanating from the hound, whose presence was palpable and almost physically heavy. The rustle of the skin separating from the meat was distinctly, even eerily audible in the dead night silence, every sound amplified in the vacuum of their unspoken emotions. Then followed a dull, wet sound as the entrails were removed and unceremoniously discarded. For them, they were utterly useless. But for any nearby forest dwellers, it would be a small but welcome feast. Arya's movements were precise, economical, almost ritualistic, as if she were performing an ancient dance of survival. No wasted motions, no haste, no anxiety, just focused, almost meditative work, where each stage had its meaning, its logic. Then she skewered the cleaned carcass onto a sturdy, straight branch that the hound had found while she was hunting. The branch had been fire-hardened, making it stronger, and its sharp end carefully pointed with his large knife. This was their unspoken, but perfectly understood division of labor. Arya acquired the food, and the hound was responsible for firewood and starting the fire. Their interaction was minimal, almost invisible, yet surprisingly efficient, allowing them to function as a single, albeit highly unfriendly, survival mechanism. The meat, carefully skewered on the makeshift spit, was placed over the fire. The heat was uneven, as is often the case with campfires, but gradually the flames began to insistently lick the rabbit's skin, and the thin, teasing, incredibly tempting aroma of roasted meat slowly but surely drifted through the damp night air. This smell was the only thing that, with each passing moment, increasingly broke the oppressive, heavy silence between them. Well, besides, of course, the furious living crackle of the fire. It wasn't just crackling. It was an entire, constantly changing orchestra of small but distinct sounds telling its own story. The quiet hiss of sap oozing from the wood. A light, almost imperceptible pop as a tiny ember flew off to the side, dissolving into the darkness. The soft, almost whispered, yet sharp sizzle as a drop of hot fat from the meat, unable to hold, dripped directly into the flame, instantly evaporating and releasing a tiny stream of fragrant smoke. These sounds were their only, yet insistent companions, filling the vast, gaping space between two souls so different, so hostile to each other. Every sizzle, every crackle, every flash of flame seemed to become part of their unspoken dialogue, their unbearable closeness. The hound continued to stare into the fire, his heavy brows furrowed, but his nostrils subtly, almost imperceptibly, to an uninitiated eye, flared, catching the increasingly rich, increasingly inviting smell of the cooking food. He showed no overt interest or impatience, his face remaining a mask carved from stone. But Arya, who now sat opposite him, legs tucked, feeling every nerve of his presence, his powerful, predatory aura, unerringly sensed his hidden anticipation. She said nothing either. Words, it seemed, were a luxury they could not afford, a dangerous weapon capable of exploding at any moment. Every word spoken between them risked turning into a bitter quarrel, a painful reminder of the past, of what bound them with blood and hatred. Micah's death, Lami's killing, countless insults, so they remained silent. The silence was heavy, thick as autumn fog, or like rich honey. It pressed on their ears, on their minds, on their souls, but at the same time, it was a kind of refuge, an impenetrable fortress, beyond whose walls there was no room for insults, threats, or painful memories. There was only the present, the burning fire, alive and constantly changing, and the cooking food, whose simple existence was the most eloquent statement. Time dragged slowly, like molasses, but inevitably, marking every moment of this strange truce. Arya carefully turned the rabbit to ensure it cooked evenly on all sides, transforming into a perfect, crispy, aromatic piece. Her gaze occasionally flickered to the hound's face, involuntarily lingering on his disfigured side, on the marks of the terrible tragedy that left its indelible imprint on him. She never showed her pity, never acknowledged his pain. That would be a weakness, and weakness in their world meant swift death. But the hound, in turn, never showed her his weaknesses, his inner struggle. They were two predators, trapped in one cage, forced to tolerate each other, to survive in a world that spared no one. The meat grew increasingly golden brown, with thin, dark streaks from the fire, promising an incredibly crunchy crust. The smell became even more intense, more inviting, awakening primal instincts of hunger. Finally, when the rabbit had reached perfection, Arya removed it from the fire. Steam rose from it in a thick, aromatic, almost tangible cloud, enveloping them like an invisible shield from the outside world. She didn't ask the hound if he wanted to eat. It was so self-evident, as natural as breathing in or out, that the question itself would have been absurd. She broke the rabbit into two unequal parts, giving him the larger, meatier portion, keeping the smaller one with less meat for herself. There was no mercy or sacrifice in this, merely a pragmatic understanding that he, being larger and stronger, required more food to remain battle-ready. She did not say, "Please," or "Thank you," and he uttered no word. He simply extended his enormous, scarred hand and took his portion. Their fingers barely, almost imperceptibly, touched, and that fleeting touch was the most intimate moment they had shared in their entire forced journey. It was forgotten as quickly as it happened. He began to eat, paying no attention to the heat, tearing the meat directly from the bone like a wild animal, satisfying its hunger. Arya also began on her part, her small, sharp teeth deftly separating meat from bone. The taste was simple, devoid of any frills, but incredibly rich, piercing. Swedish meat, infused with smoke, with a crispy, slightly charred crust. It was the taste of survival, the taste of victory over all-consuming hunger and emptiness, the taste of instantaneous, yet so desired, relief. Each bite was accompanied by a quiet but distinct chewing sound, which seemed to be the only permitted sound in this unspoken, almost ritualistic feast. Neither of them rushed. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every piece, every fiber of meat, every crumb, because they knew that the next meal might not come soon, or might not come at all. The silence remained thick as a wall, but now it lacked the sharp, cutting tension that had prevailed before the meal began. It was filled with something like mutual acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that despite all the outward hatred and hidden animosity, they were now sharing something far greater than just food. They were sharing a moment of peace, a moment of temporary truce, as fragile as it was necessary. Even the sound of their own breaths seemed deafeningly loud in this thin silence, broken only by the whisper of the night wind. The creak of branches as one of them shifted position, the crackle of the fire, which now burned brighter and hotter, casting long, dancing shadows on the silhouettes of the trees around. The night forest, which had previously seemed hostile and full of dangers, was now merely a silent witness to this strange, unspoken meal, this impossible union. When the rabbit was eaten down to the last bone, when even the smallest bits of meat had been scraped off, Arya carefully set the remains aside for any nocturnal predators that might come for the scent. The hound wiped his enormous rough hands on his worn breeches, his face still inscrutable, his usual sullen expression unwavering. No words of thanks, no words of satisfaction, and Arya, of course, expected none. They sank back into silence, only now it wasn't as tense, not as heavy. The campfire's flame slowly died down, its light weakening, casting the last, barely noticeable flickering shadows before finally extinguishing. The air grew even colder, chilling through their clothes, but the feeling of fullness, the warmth in their stomachs, provided some comfort, granting an illusion of safety. They sat there for some time longer, simply watching the slowly dying embers as the last sparks flew into the sky to dissolve into the infinitude of the starry night. Perhaps each of them was lost in their own thoughts, immersed in their own world of memories. Arya, of her family, of lost Winterfell, of the brotherhood without banners, of all those she had lost and wanted to find, of the vengeance that burned within her. The hound, of his own demons, of the cruel brother who disfigured his face with fire, of the meaningless cruelties of the world he was forced to live in, of his own insoluble pain. But these thoughts were personal, their own, and they did not share them with each other, not even with glances. In that moment, they were simply two people sitting by a fire, sharing food that helped them survive another night, another step in their endless, dangerous journey. This is the profound paradox of this world, full of evil and injustice. Sometimes the deepest connections, or at least the most unexpected and seemingly impossible truces, arise not from grand oaths or loud speeches, but from the most mundane, most basic human needs. Hunger, piercing cold, the animal, untamed necessity to survive. They can bring even the bitterest enemies together, creating a bridge where there seemed to be only a chasm. This stolen rabbit, a simple act of survival, became such a bridge between Arya and the hound. A bridge fragile, temporary, capable of collapsing at any moment from one careless word, one irritated glance, one rekindled memory. But for that night, in that wilderness of the Riverlands, it held. It allowed them to forget for a few precious moments about hatred, about revenge, about injustice, about death. It allowed them to simply be two beings, sharing warmth and food in an indifferent, all-consuming darkness that hid them from the world. And in that almost unbearable, but now less oppressive silence, filled only with the rare, barely audible sounds of the night forest and the dying fire, lay their entire complex, unspoken story, the whole drama of their impossible union. It was their way of communicating without words, their way of tolerating each other, their way of continuing to move forward, overcoming themselves and the world around them every day, in a world that gave them no peace. And that was far more than many could say about their most sincere and passionate relationships. What do you think of this quiet truce? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the world of Westeros. The silence in Sansa Stark's chambers wasn't empty. It was full. It was like the bated breath of the castle, like a pause in conversation that lasts too long and is about to be broken. Golden tapestries depicting hunting scenes and feasts muffled the sounds of the outside world, but couldn't hide the core feeling, a journey unfinished. It was as if Sansa herself had stopped halfway to something crucial, and now her own life was merely an echo of steps halted in the middle of a long, dark corridor. The air, thick and still, held the memory of drafts that used to sweep through, of words spoken and cut short. Everything here was in its place. Silk pillows, a silver water pitcher, a carved wooden box. But beneath this orderliness lay a premonition of movement, as if an invisible river flowed beneath the stone floor of her prison, and Sansa was learning to hear its current. This was the geography of survival, a map she drew not on parchment, but in her own mind, where every forgotten corner was a potential route to salvation, even if temporary. The path home had been interrupted, but the journey continued. Only now it delved inward, into the very walls of her home, which had become a stranger. In the evening, as the crimson hues of sunset deepened over King's Landing outside her window, Sansa would sit at her small, dark wooden table. Her actions were slow and deliberate, like a ritual, helping her regain strength after unseen journeys. Today, she was mending an old travel cloak, the very one she had once worn leaving the north. The fabric was coarse, faded, smelling of dust and distant rain. Sansa's fingers, accustomed to fine embroidery, held the thick needle with certainty. Each stitch wasn't just joining torn edges. It was an act of restoration, an attempt to mend a breach not only in the fabric, but in her memory. She wasn't mending the cloak to wear it on the road again. This action was something else. As she guided the needle through the dense material, her mind returned to her secret work. She recalled the narrow, cold, and dark servant passages where the air smelled of damp and mice. She remembered the squeak of a particular floorboard on the third floor of the West Wing, which warned her of approaching guards long before their steps became audible in the main corridor. Mending the cloak was merely preparation for another day in this quiet war, where knowledge of secret paths was her only weapon. She smoothed the seam, her lips barely moving, reciting the route. From the laundry, up the spiral staircase, past the armory, through the abandoned storeroom, from where she could overhear conversations in the small council. This cloak was her old map, and the new stitches were markings on it that only she could read. One day, early in her explorations, Sansa stumbled upon a small niche behind a tapestry depicting Aegon's battle with the Dornish. She slipped inside, and her heart pounded so loudly it felt like the entire castle could hear it. This wasn't the fear of being caught. It was something else. In the cramped, dusty space, barely large enough to stand, she felt for the first time in a long while not like an object of observation, but an observer. The emotion of that moment was overwhelming. Not the thrill of discovery, but a deep, piercing loneliness that suddenly transformed into its opposite, freedom. She pressed her cheek against the cold, rough stone and closed her eyes. The smells of this hideaway, ancient dust, dried cobwebs, a faint hint of wine from the cellars, became the scent of mystery for her. She stood there, frozen, and listened. Through the thick stone, muffled sounds of the castle's life filtered through. Distant laughter, the clatter of dishes, the creak of a heavy door. But here, in her sanctuary, there was absolute silence. In that moment, Sansa understood that the castle had an underside, a secret life hidden from the eyes of lords and ladies. And this underside could become her world. She wasn't thinking of escape, not making plans. She simply breathed, absorbing this feeling, to be invisible in the very heart of the enemy's citadel. It was a sense of tiny but genuine control, and it was more precious than any treasure. Now, every rustle behind the wall, every draft that shouldn't have been there, held meaning for Sansa. The consequences of her secret journeys wove themselves into the fabric of her daily life. She learned to sleep lightly, waking not from nightmares, but from sounds that for others were just part of the old castle's nocturnal life. She grew accustomed to a slight, almost phantom fatigue in her legs each morning, as if she truly had walked many miles along secret paths, rather than simply sleeping in her bed. This fatigue was a shadow of her adventures, a constant reminder of the double life she was leading. Sometimes, running her hand along her room's wall, she would feel a barely perceptible vibration. Someone at the far end of the castle was opening a heavy secret door, and the tremor would pass through the building's entire stone skeleton. For Sansa, this was the castle's pulse, its secret heartbeat. She no longer felt trapped within four walls. The walls had become her allies, her map, her sanctuary. She knew that beyond this stone was a narrow crawl space leading to an old cistern, and beyond that tapestry, a staircase that led directly to the kitchens. This knowledge was her invisible armor. It didn't protect against direct threats, but it gave her a sense of space and possibility that kept despair from completely engulfing her. She lived in anticipation, but it wasn't a passive waiting for salvation from outside, but an active anticipation of the moment when her knowledge could be used. One night, as the castle settled into a deep slumber, Sansa sat by the window, gazing at the moonlight flooding the inner courtyard. She wasn't sleeping, listening to the familiar symphony of night sounds, and suddenly, amidst the creaking beams and the howling wind in the chimneys, she caught something new. It was a quiet, barely discernible scraping sound. It wasn't coming from the corridor, nor from the courtyard. It came from the wall, from that very wall, behind which, she knew, lay one of the oldest and most abandoned passages, leading deep into the Red Keep's dungeons. Sansa froze, turning entirely into an ear. The scraping repeated, a little clearer this time. It wasn't the sound of rats or crumbling stones. It was measured, almost deliberate, as if someone or something was slowly moving a heavy stone block. Sansa slowly rose and approached the wall. She pressed her ear to the cold surface, holding her breath. The sound stopped. A ringing silence fell, even more intense than the preceding noise. In this silence, Sansa felt another presence. There, beyond the thick stone, was someone else. Someone who also knew about the secret paths. The silhouette of this invisible being arose in her imagination. Not a person and not a ghost, but another labyrinth explorer, another prisoner or player. She didn't know if it was friend or foe. It was a hidden event that disturbed her established order. Her secret map had suddenly become incomplete. A new, unknown route, laid by someone else, had appeared on it. Sansa quietly moved away from the wall and sat on the edge of her bed. She didn't dare to act, didn't try to give a responding sign. She simply watched the silence, which was now filled with a question. Her mind raced, weighing all the pros and cons. Who could it be? A servant leading a secret life? Varys' spy checking old passages, or something far more ancient and dangerous, dwelling in the dungeons long before the castle was built? The thought of risk gripped her heart with an icy hand. Any careless movement, any sound, could expose her, and then her fragile world, built on secret knowledge, would crumble. She could be suspected of conspiracy, and the consequences would be dire. On the other hand, this sound was the first sign in a long time that she wasn't alone in her quiet war. It was a promise, an alluring call into the unknown. The urge to explore, to continue her journey, wrestled within her with the instinct for self-preservation, with the desire to maintain the peace and control she had worked so hard to achieve. Staying here, in her rooms, pretending to be an obedient little bird, was safe. But the sound from the wall reminded her that beyond her comfortable cage lay an entire world, full of dangers, but also opportunities. She recalled the feeling of freedom in the dusty niche behind the tapestry. Was it worth risking this fragile piece for the faint chance of finding an ally or unraveling another castle mystery? The struggle was almost physical. Sansa felt her muscles tense, her fingers grow cold. Go or stay, reveal her map, or hide it even deeper. After long, agonizing deliberation, Sansa made her choice. Not yet. The risk was too great, and the unknown, too terrifying. She wasn't ready to gamble her life on an unclear sound from behind a wall. She slowly walked to the table where her old cloak, with its new, neat stitches, lay. She carefully folded it and put it away in the furthest corner of her travel chest, beneath a pile of dresses she would never wear again. Then she approached the heavy velvet curtain and drew it tightly shut, cutting off the moonlight and the view of the quiet courtyard. The room plunged into almost complete darkness, broken only by the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. This gesture was a farewell, but a temporary one. She wasn't abandoning her knowledge, not burning her mental maps. She was simply putting her journey on pause. Sansa lay down in bed and pulled the blanket over her, wrapping herself in it as if trying to shield herself not from the cold, but from the call of the unknown. She closed her eyes, but not to sleep. She listened to herself, to the beating of her own heart, trying to regain the sense of calm and control that had been disturbed. She had made the choice not to go, but inside, everything was ready. Every muscle, every nerve was taut, like a string, ready to resonate at the right moment. Silence once again reigned in the room. The same full, thick silence, but now it held a new nuance. The nuance of awaiting an answer to an unasked question. The scraping behind the wall didn't repeat. Perhaps it hadn't even been real. Perhaps it was just a trick of her tired imagination, born of loneliness and tension. Or perhaps the other one was listening too, and also made their choice, to lie in wait. Sansa lay in the darkness, her gaze fixed on the wall, which now seemed not merely a barrier, but a border between two secret worlds. She didn't know if they would ever intersect, but the trace left in the silence would never disappear. It remained in her memory, like a mark on a map, a reminder that her solitary journey might not be so solitary after all. And perhaps, the next time she hears a sound like that, she will be ready not only to listen, but to respond. If you found Sansa's silent war as fascinating as we did, give this video a like, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into your favorite stories. What do you think the sound from the wall meant? Let us know in the comments below.